You ever get that feeling that a job is too good to be true, but your bank account is so low that your common sense just takes a back seat? That's where I was 3 years ago. I was finishing up my master's in library science, buried in student debt, and living off generic brand ramen. When I saw the listing on a private job board for a document digitization specialist, I didn't care that the location was 3 hours away from the nearest city or that the pay was nearly triple the industry standard. I just saw a way out of the hole. The employer was a man named Arthur Vance. He didn't do a Zoom call. He didn't even ask for a formal interview. He just wanted to see my credentials and a background check. 2 days later, I was driving my beat-up sedan through a thick, oppressive fog into the heart of the Cascades. The Vance estate wasn't a mansion in the modern sense. It was a sprawling, Victorian-style relic that looked like it was being slowly swallowed by the surrounding hemlocks and pines. It was gray, peeling, and sat at the end of a gravel driveway that felt like it was designed to pop tires. Arthur met me at the door. He was thin, unnervingly so, with skin that looked like parchment paper stretched over a bird skeleton. He didn't shake my hand. He just nodded and led me straight through a house that smelled like mothballs and damp earth, down a flight of narrow wooden stairs into the basement. "The archives are here," he said, his voice like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "My family has a long history in this county. Land deals, timber rights, private correspondence. I want it all preserved digitally before the damp claims it. You'll work from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. I prefer the house quiet during the day." I should have asked why the night shift was necessary for scanning paper. I should have asked why he looked like he hadn't slept since the 90s. But I looked at the equipment, a high-end book eye scanner, and a workstation that cost more than my car, and I just nodded. He pointed to a stack of heavy, wax-sealed banker boxes lined up against the far concrete wall. There were hundreds of them. "Start with box 1A, he instructed, already backing toward the stairs. "Do not go upstairs for any reason. There is a kitchenette and a bathroom down here. I will leave your meals at the top of the stairs. Good night, Elias." The heavy door at the top of the stairs clicked shut, and I heard the unmistakable slide of a deadbolt. I stood there for a minute, the hum of the dehumidifier the only sound in the room. The basement was huge, divided into sections by heavy plastic sheeting that hung from the ceiling, probably to keep the dust down. It felt like a surgical suite inside a tomb. I walked over to box 1A, broke the wax seal with a pocket knife, and pulled out the first folder. It wasn't land deeds. The first page was a handwritten log dated August 14th, 1972. It was a list of names. Next to each name was a height, a weight, and a point of origin. My heart did a weird little skip. I told myself it was just old census data or maybe payroll for a logging camp. I sat down, turned on the scanner, and began the repetitive motion of laying the pages flat. About 2 hours in, the silence of the basement started to feel heavy. You know that weight? Like the air is getting thicker because no one has breathed it in a century? I put on my headphones, but I didn't play music. I kept them off ear, a habit I picked up living in bad neighborhoods. I always want to hear what's coming. That's when I heard the first thump. It came from directly above the scanning station. It wasn't the sound of someone walking. It sounded like something heavy being dragged slowly across the floorboards. Scrape, pause, scrape. I froze, my hand hovering over the glass of the scanner. The sound moved from left to right, then stopped right over the stairs. I waited. My breath held until my chest ached. Nothing, just the hum of the machine. I laughed at myself, a dry, nervous sound. "Old house, Elias," I whispered. "Just an old man moving furniture." I turned back to the folder I was currently scanning. It was a collection of Polaroids clipped to a series of observation notes. I picked up the first photo. It was a grainy shot of a young woman standing at a gas station, completely unaware she was being photographed. The note attached read, "Subject 42, high metabolic rate, no local ties, perfect for the transition." A cold chill that had nothing to do with the basement air crawled up my spine. I flipped to the next photo and my blood turned to ice. It was a photo of the very gravel driveway I had driven up earlier that evening. But in the frame, tucked behind a tree, was my own car. And then the light in the basement flickered and died, plunging me into total suffocating darkness. In the silence, I heard the deadbolt at the top of the stairs slowly slide open. The darkness in that basement wasn't normal. It was absolute. Without the hum of the computer or the glow of the scanner, the room felt like it had physically shrunk, pressing in on me from all sides. I sat perfectly still, my fingers still gripping the edges of that Polaroid. My heart was hammering so hard against my ribs, I was sure Arthur, or whoever was at the top of those stairs, could hear it. The deadbolt had clicked, but the door didn't creak open immediately. Instead, there was a long, agonizing silence. I reached out blindly, my hand sweeping across the desk until I felt the cold plastic of my flashlight. I didn't turn it on yet. I didn't want to be a target. Then the sound started again. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It wasn't coming from the stairs anymore. It was coming from behind the plastic sheeting at the far end of the room. My mind raced, trying to map out the basement layout I'd seen for only 5 minutes. The kitchenette was to my left, the bathroom behind me, and the vast sheet-partition storage area straight ahead. The dragging sound was wet, rhythmic, and heavy. I finally clicked the flashlight on, keeping the beam low to the floor. The circle of light cut through the dust motes, illuminating the concrete. I panned it toward the plastic sheets. They were swaying. There was no vent down here, no breeze, but the heavy, translucent plastic was rippling as if something was moving behind it, pacing back and forth. "Mr. Vance," I called out. My voice sounded thin, cracking at the end. "The power went out. I'm going to need a minute to reset." No answer. Only the scrape stopped. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead. I needed to get to those stairs. If Arthur had unlocked the door, it was my only way out. I didn't care about the job, the money, or the master's degree anymore. That photo of my car, the one taken from the woods, meant this wasn't a clerical error. It was a hunt. I moved away from the desk, keeping my back against the cold stone wall. Every step felt like a mile. As I bypassed the first row of banker boxes, my flashlight caught something on the floor. A trail. It looked like dark oil at first, but as I got closer, the metallic scent hit me. It was a smear of something viscous and dark, leading directly from the area behind the plastic sheets toward the base of the stairs. I followed the trail with the beam of light. It didn't stop at the stairs. It went up them. Suddenly, the power surged back on, but it wasn't the overhead fluorescence. It was the emergency red light over the exit door and the glow of the computer monitor. The monitor, which I had left on a file explorer screen, was now displaying a single image. It was a live feed. The camera angle was high, looking down into the very basement where I stood. In the graininess of the low-light video, I could see myself, a small, terrified figure holding a flashlight. But as I stared at the screen, I realized the camera wasn't fixed. It was wobbling slightly. Someone was holding it. I looked at the feed, then slowly tracked the angle in the real room. The camera was positioned behind the plastic sheeting, about 7 feet off the ground. As I watched the monitor, a hand appeared in the frame of the video. It was long, the fingers tipped with jagged yellowed nails. The hand reached out and slowly parted the plastic sheets. On the screen, I saw the face of the person holding the camera. It wasn't Arthur Vance. It was a man I recognized from the files I had scanned just 20 minutes prior, a man labeled as Subject 14, Discontinued. His face was a map of poorly healed scars, his eyes milky with cataracts, yet he was staring directly into the lens with a wide, manic grin. Then the monitor went black again, and a voice whispered from the darkness right behind my ear. "Keep scanning, Elias. You aren't finished with the 70s yet." I spun around, swinging my heavy flashlight like a club, but I hit nothing but air. The basement was empty, or at least it appeared to be. I bolted for the stairs, my lungs burning, and scrambled up the wooden steps 3 at a time. I grabbed the handle of the door, praying it was still unlocked.
The knob turned. The door swung open a mere 2 inches before it slammed against a heavy metal chain on the other side. Through the narrow gap, I didn't see the hallway of the house. I saw a pair of pale, bare feet standing on the landing. And then a small handwritten note was pushed through the crack. It fluttered to the floor at my feet. I picked it up, my hands shaking so violently I could barely read it. Box 1B contains the maps. If you want to see the sun, find the one marked the root cellar. From behind me, down in the pitch-black basement, I heard the sound of a heavy box being dragged across the floor. Box 1B. I stood on that narrow landing, staring at the 2-inch gap of the chained door. The pale feet on the other side didn't move. They were motionless, waxy, and positioned so close to the door that the person's toes were nearly touching the wood. I wanted to scream, to beg, to offer him my car keys, anything to get out. But the memory of that voice in the basement, that dry, papery whisper, kept my throat constricted. "Arthur," I croaked, "please, I'm done. I don't want the money. Just let me go." No answer. The feet remained. Then, slowly, the door was pulled shut from the outside. I heard the heavy clack of the deadbolt sliding back into place. I was locked in again. I had no choice. I turned back toward the dark maw of the basement. The red emergency light cast long, distorted shadows that looked like grasping limbs against the concrete. I descended the stairs, every creak of the wood sounding like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. When I reached the bottom, I saw it. Box 1B had been moved. When I first arrived, it had been tucked neatly under a stack near the back wall. Now it sat directly in the center of the room, positioned right under the single glowing computer monitor. The wax seal wasn't just broken, it had been shredded, as if by something with claws. I approached the desk, my flashlight beam dancing nervously. I reached into the box and pulled out a roll of heavy architectural vellum. As I unfurled it across the scanning bed, I realized I wasn't looking at land deeds or timber rights. It was a blueprint of the estate. But it was wrong. The lines didn't follow the logic of any house I'd ever seen. They were rooms with no doors, hallways that led into solid earth, and a series of subterranean tunnels that branched out like a nervous system beneath the forced floor. One area was circled, in thick red grease pencil, the root cellar. According to the map, the entrance to this cellar wasn't in the house. It was located behind the very plastic sheeting where Subject 14 had been filming me. I looked at the sheet. It hung limp and silent now, but the smell coming from behind it had changed. It no longer smelled like damp earth. It smelled like copper and industrial-grade bleach. I walked toward the plastic, my heart drumming a frantic rhythm. I used the edge of my flashlight to peel back the heavy curtain. Behind it wasn't just more storage. It was a workspace. There was a heavy steel table bolted to the floor, surrounded by rusted medical equipment that looked like it belonged in a 1940s asylum. But it wasn't the equipment that made my stomach churn. It was the walls. They were covered, floor to ceiling, in my own name, Elias, Elias, Elias. Written in what looked like charcoal, thousands of times over, the handwriting getting more frantic and jagged the higher it went. In the center of the far wall was a heavy wooden hatch flush with the floor. This was it, the root cellar. I knelt down, my fingers fumbling with the iron ring of the hatch. It was ice cold. As I pulled, the wood groaned, protesting years of disuse. The smell that billowed out was overwhelming. A mix of ancient rot and something strangely sweet, like overripe fruit. I shone my light down into the hole. A ladder made of rebar disappeared into the depths. I didn't want to go down there. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run back to the stairs and try to kick the door down. But then, my flashlight caught something on the first rung of the ladder. It was a wedding ring. I recognized it instantly. It belonged to my sister, Sarah. She had gone missing 3 years ago. Her car found abandoned at a rest stop 2 counties over. The police had called it a voluntary disappearance. I had spent every cent I had trying to find her. My hands began to shake so violently I almost dropped the light. Sarah wasn't just a subject in a file. She was here, or she had been. I gripped the rebar rungs and began to climb down. The air grew colder with every foot I descended. The basement above me felt like a sanctuary compared to the suffocating blackness of the shaft. I reached the bottom and stepped onto dirt floor. I panned my light around. This wasn't a root cellar. It was a gallery. Dozens of glass jars sat on wooden shelves filled with a clear preservative fluid. Inside each jar was a personal item, a watch, a lock of hair, a pair of glasses, and next to each jar was a meticulously typed biography of the owner. I walked deeper into the tunnel, the ceiling so low I had to hunch over. The walls here weren't stone or concrete. They were packed earth, held up by rotting timber. I reached the end of the shelf and stopped. There was a final jar. It was empty. The label next to it was already typed. Subject 104, Elias Thorne. The sound of the hatch slamming shut above me echoed through the tunnel like a thunderclap. I spun around, my light hitting the ceiling. The hatch was gone, replaced by a solid slab of stone that looked like it had been there for centuries. I was buried alive. Then, from the darkness further down the tunnel, a part my light couldn't reach, I heard a soft, wet coughing sound. Elias? The voice was weak, raspy, and sounded like it was coming through a throat filled with glass. But I knew that voice. Sarah? I whispered, stepping forward into the dark. The light of my flashlight flickered once, twice, and then died completely, leaving me in a silence so thick I could hear the blood rushing through my own veins. And then, something cold and damp pressed against the back of my neck. The touch on the back of my neck wasn't a hand. It felt like a collection of thin, freezing cold wires, or maybe hair. I lurched forward, stumbling blindly into the pitch-black tunnel, my hands outspread until they slammed into the rough, damp earth of the sidewall. I frantically slapped the side of my flashlight, praying for a spark of life. Click, click. The beam sputtered back to life, but it was dim, a sickly yellow circle that barely cut through the gloom. I whipped the light back toward where I had been standing. There was no one there, but the air was swirling with dust, and a single, long strand of dark hair was caught on a splinter of the timber support where my head had just been. Sarah? I called out again, my voice cracking. Sarah, where are you? Don't look up, the voice rasped. It came from the darkness ahead of me, but it didn't sound like it was coming from a person. It sounded like the earth itself was vibrating. I ignored the warning. I tilted the flashlight upward, the dim beam crawling across the low ceiling of the tunnel. I nearly dropped the light. The ceiling wasn't made of wood or stone. It was a lattice of roots, thick and gnarled, but woven in between the roots were clothes, hundreds of items of clothing, shirts, dresses, jackets, all matted into the dirt, acting as a grotesque insulation. And hanging from the roots, like oversized cocoons, were heavy burlap-wrapped shapes. They were roughly the size of human bodies, bound tightly with wire. One of the shapes was twitching. Elias, run, the voice whispered from the twitching bag. I scrambled toward it, my boots slipping on the slick mud. I reached up, my fingers clawing at the rough burlap. The wire was rusted and bit into my palms, drawing blood, but I didn't feel the pain. I ripped a hole in the fabric, and a face shoved its way through the gap. It was Sarah, but she looked wrong. Her skin was translucent, waxy gray, and her eyes were wide, the pupils blown out until they were entirely black. She wasn't just tied up. The roots from the ceiling had begun to grow into her, stitching themselves into her collarbone and the corners of her mouth. I have to get you down, I sobbed, pulling at the burlap. I'm going to get you out of here. He's coming back, Elias, she hissed, her voice a wet rattle. "He doesn't want the files. He needs the narrative. The scanning, it's how he feeds the house. The memory of us, that's what keeps the wood from rotting." I didn't understand what she was saying. My mind was in full-blown shock. I grabbed a sharp piece of rebar from the floor and started hacking at the roots connecting her to the ceiling. Each time the metal sliced through a root, Sarah let out a sound that wasn't a scream. It was the sound of a tree limb snapping in a storm. Suddenly, the tunnel hummed, a low-frequency vibration that I felt in my teeth. From the direction of the hatch I had entered through, I heard a rhythmic thud, thud, thud. It was the sound of someone walking on the stone slab above. But it wasn't just one person. It sounded like a dozen people all marching in perfect unison. "The transition," Sarah whispered, her eyes rolling back in her head. "He's starting the transition. If you're down here when the bells ring, you become part of the archive." "Who is he, Sarah? Arthur?" "He's just the librarian," she said, a single tear of dark, oily fluid tracking down her cheek. "The owner is in the walls. He's the one who takes the photos. He's the one who watched you from the trees." The marching above stopped. A heavy metallic clink echoed through the tunnel. It was the sound of a winch turning. I looked back toward the end of the tunnel, and my dim light caught the movement of a heavy iron grate sliding upward, revealing a second, deeper level of the cellar. From that new opening, a smell hit me that made me retch. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse that had been closed for a decade. And then the light of a dozen high-powered flashlights flooded the tunnel from the other side of the grate. I shielded my eyes, squinting against the glare. Figures were standing there. They were wearing heavy yellow chemical suits and gas masks. They didn't look like monsters. They looked like professionals. They moved with a terrifying, clinical efficiency. One of them stepped forward holding a long pneumatic bolt gun, the kind used for cattle. "Subject 104 is out of the designated zone. Initiate retrieval. Ensure the sister remains integrated. The owner is hungry tonight." I looked at Sarah. She was looking past me, her gaze fixed on the men in yellow. "Run, Elias," she breathed, her voice a wet rattle. "The tunnels lead to the old well. Don't look at the faces in the water." The man with the bolt gun raised his weapon. I didn't wait. I turned and sprinted in the opposite direction, deeper into the dark, toward the narrow crawl space Sarah had pointed out. Behind me, I heard the heavy hiss of pressurized gas and the sound of Sarah screaming, a sound that was abruptly cut short by a wet, heavy thud. I dove into the crawl space, the dirt pressing against my chest and back, the walls so tight I had to exhale just to move forward. I could hear the yellow-suited men behind me, their heavy boots thumping against the earth. "He's in the feeder tunnel," one of them shouted. "Seal the wellhead. Don't let him reach the surface." I crawled faster, my fingernails tearing as I clawed at the dirt. The tunnel began to slope upward, and the smell of fresh rain, blessed cold rain, started to filter through the soil. I saw a glimmer of moonlight above me. But as I reached for the opening, a hand reached down from the surface. It wasn't a yellow glove. It was a bare, withered hand. Arthur Vance leaned over the edge of the well, looking down at me with a look of profound disappointment. "You were doing such a good job with the 70s, Elias. Now we have to start the whole box over." He held up a heavy, jagged rock.
Arthur didn't drop the rock. Not at first. He just held it there, silhouetted against the pale, sickly moon, watching me like a scientist observing a trapped rat in a maze. I was pinned in that narrow, vertical shaft, my shoulders wedged against the cold, damp stones of the old well. Below me, I could hear the heavy breathing of the men in the yellow suits as they reached the base of the climb. "Please," I gasped, my voice barely a whisper. "My sister, she's still down there. What are you doing to her?" Arthur's face didn't change. No malice, no anger, just that terrifying, clinical detachment. "Sarah is part of the foundation now, Elias. She provides the context. Every house needs a history to keep it upright. Without the stories, the wood rots. The memories act as the resin." He leaned closer, and I could smell the mothballs on his breath. You, however, you were meant to be the witness, the one who transcribes the suffering into a format the future can digest. But you got curious. You broke the narrative flow. Below me, a gloved hand grabbed my ankle. The grip was like a vice, crushing the bone. I let out a jagged scream and kicked out with my free leg, my boot connecting with something hard, a gas mask, I hoped. I felt the grip loosen for a split second, and I used every ounce of adrenaline left in my system to lunge upward, grabbing the mossy rim of the well. Arthur finally dropped the rock. I saw it leave his hand in slow motion. I jerked my head to the side, and the stone grazed my temple, tearing a jagged line through my skin and sending a spray of blood across the white stones. The impact made my vision explode into white sparks, but I didn't let go. I couldn't. I scrambled over the edge, rolling onto the wet grass, the cold rain hitting my face like a million tiny needles. I didn't look back. I didn't look for Sarah. I just ran. I was in the woods behind the estate. The trees were dense, their branches clawing at my clothes and face as I sprinted blindly through the undergrowth. I could hear them behind me, the heavy, rhythmic thumping of the retrieval team. They weren't running, they were jogging, a steady, tireless pace that told me they knew exactly where I was going. I reached a small clearing and stopped, my lungs feeling like they were filled with broken glass. I turned in a circle, trying to find my bearings. The house was a dark, hulking shape to my left, its windows glowing with a dim, pulsating red light. To my right was the dense forest. But as I looked at the trees, I realized something was wrong. The trees weren't moving with the wind. They were perfectly still, despite the storm. And as my eyes adjusted to the dark, I saw them. Not people, shapes, tucked into the crooks of the branches, perched on the limbs like oversized vultures. They were the subjects. Dozens of them, men, women, children, all dressed in the outdated clothes I had seen in the archive photos. Their skin was the same waxy gray as Sarah's, their eyes wide and vacant. They weren't attacking, they were just watching. They were the audience for the narrative Arthur had mentioned. "Help me!" I screamed at them. "Please!" None of them moved. But then one of the figures, a man in a 1950s flannel shirt, raised a trembling hand and pointed toward a small, dilapidated shed near the edge of the property. I didn't have any other options. The yellow suits were breaking through the tree line, their high-powered beams cutting through the fog. I ran for the shed, my boots squelching in the mud. I tore the door open and slammed the bolt shut just as a flashlight beam swept across the wood. The shed was small, smelling of gasoline and old hay. I backed into the corner, clutching a rusted garden rake as a makeshift weapon. I waited for the door to be kicked in, for the bolt gun to find its mark. But the silence that followed was even worse. Minutes passed. The rain hammered on the tin roof, a deafening metallic roar. I peered through a crack in the wall. The men in the yellow suits were gone. The clearing was empty. Even the figures in the trees had vanished. Then, a small battery-operated radio on a workbench in the corner crackled to life. Static filled the room, followed by the sound of a woman sobbing. It was a recording. "It's August 14th, 1972. My name is Martha. I don't know where he took my shoes. Please, if anyone hears this." The recording cut out. A new voice came through, Arthur's voice, but it sounded younger, stronger. "Entry 1. The introduction is complete. The subject has found the sanctuary. Now we begin the escalation." A heavy, wet thud hit the roof of the shed, then another, then another. Something was being dropped onto the building from above. I looked up just as a dark, viscous liquid began to leak through the gaps in the tin, dripping onto the floor with a rhythmic splat. It was the same dark, oily fluid I had seen on Sarah's face, and it was rising.
The liquid wasn't just oil, and it wasn't just blood. It was thick, smelling of old paper and copper, and as it pooled around my boots, I realized with a jolt of pure electricity that it was moving. It didn't just flow, it pulsed,
seeking out the cracks in the floorboards and the seams of my shoes. I scrambled onto the workbench, my breath coming in short, panicked hitches as the floor of the shed disappeared beneath a rising tide of black ink. The radio crackled again. The static was gone now, replaced by a sound I'll never forget. The sound of a typewriter. Clack, 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 ding. It was fast, impossibly fast, a frantic mechanical staccato that seemed to be coming from inside the walls of the shed itself. Part 6, Arthur's voice boomed from the radio, his tone now cold and professorial. The isolation. The subject realizes that the walls are not a shelter, but a skin. As he spoke, the wooden planks of the shed began to groan, not the groan of wind, but a sound like joints popping. I watched in horror as the knots in the wood began to bulge. They weren't knots anymore. They were eyes. Dozens of them, amber and unblinking, pushing through the grain of the timber. They all swiveled in unison to look at me. "What do you want?" I screamed, swinging the rusted rake at the nearest cluster of eyes. The metal tines bit into the wood, and a high-pitched feminine shriek erupted from the wall. A thick, clear fluid leaked from the wound, mixing with the black ink on the floor. "We want the completion, Elias. The archive is hungry for the ending. Every story needs a climax. Every climax needs a sacrifice." The workbench beneath me began to soften. The solid wood turned to something resembling wet cardboard, then soft, yielding flesh. I felt my feet sinking into it. I tried to pull away, but the surface was adhesive, sucking at my soles. I looked down and saw my own name being etched on the surface of the workbench, the letters forming as if an invisible hand were carving them from beneath the wood. Elias Thorne, born 1998, died. The date was blank, the wood fluttering like a pulse where the numbers should be. I realized then that the estate wasn't just a house, it was a living record, a physical manifestation of every life Arthur and his family had harvested. The subjects weren't just prisoners, they were the literal building blocks of the property. The trees were the lungs, the soil was the stomach, and this shed, this was the mouth. I knew if I stayed there another minute I'd be absorbed. I'd become a footnote in box 1B. I lunged for the small window at the back of the shed. It was barely a foot wide, choked with grime and cobwebs. I smashed the glass with my elbow, ignoring the shards that sliced into my forearm. The ink on the floor was at my knees now, pulling me down with the weight of 1,000 lead weights. It felt like hands were grabbing my ankles, dragging me into the depths of the black pool. I pulled myself up, my muscles screaming, and managed to hook my chin over the windowsill. Outside, the rain was still falling, but the world looked different. The trees were leaning toward the shed, their branches interlocking to form a cage. From the darkness of the woods, a figure emerged. It wasn't a man in a yellow suit. It was Subject 14, the man with the scarred face from the live feed. He was holding a heavy, old-fashioned camera, the kind with a flashbulb that looked like a silver dish. He raised the camera to his eye. "Smile, Elias. The climax needs a photo." The flash went off, a blinding, searing white light that felt like it burned my retinas. In that split second of total blindness, the pressure on my legs vanished, the suction of the floor stopped. I threw myself through the window, tumbling onto the muddy ground outside. I didn't wait for my vision to clear. I ran toward the only place I hadn't been, the main house. It was a gamble, a death trap, but the woods were alive and the shed was digesting itself. As I sprinted toward the back porch, I saw the silhouettes of the retrieval team moving through the trees behind me, their yellow suits glowing like toxic fireflies. I reached the porch and dove through the screen door. The kitchen was dark, save for one light coming from the hallway. There, sitting at a small wooden table, was a woman. She was typing. She didn't look up as I burst in, covered in mud and blood. She just kept hitting the keys. I approached her slowly, my rake held out like a spear. When I got close enough to see her face, I stopped dead. It was Sarah. But she was different than she had been in the tunnel. She looked healthy, her skin glowing in the lamplight, her hair neatly pinned back. But when she turned to look at me, her mouth didn't move. A speaker embedded in the wall behind her spoke for her. "You're late for your shift, Elias. We're already on Chapter 7. She reached out and grabbed my wrist. Her grip was cold, not the cold of a person, but the cold of a stone. She pulled my hand toward the typewriter. "Help me finish the sentence," the wall speaker commanded. I looked at the paper in the machine. It was a description of a man standing in a kitchen, holding a rusted rake, his heart stopping as he realized his sister had been replaced by a puppet. And then the kitchen floor began to tilt, the entire house groaning as it started to lean toward the dark open mouth of the woods. The floor didn't just tilt, it heaved. It felt like being on the deck of a sinking ship, only the ocean was made of ancient, hungry timber. Sarah, or the thing that looked like her, didn't lose its balance. Her fingers remained glued to the typewriter keys even as the table slid 3 feet across the linoleum. Her eyes were fixed on mine, empty and glassy, reflecting the dim red glow emanating from the hallway. "Sarah, stop! We have to get out of here!" I screamed, trying to yank my wrist from her frozen grip. Her hand felt like it was carved from marble. The speaker in the wall crackled again, the voice now layered with the sounds of 1,000 whispering voices. "The narrative must be cohesive, Elias. A story with a hole is a house with a leak. You are the missing punctuation." I looked down at the typewriter. The keys were moving on their own now, slapping against the paper with a rhythmic, bone-chilling speed. I read the fresh ink as it appeared. Elias felt his sister's touch and knew it was the end of his autonomy. He surrendered his breath to the archives. "No!" I roared. I swung the rusted rake with my free hand. I didn't hit the puppet version of my sister. I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I smashed the typewriter. The metal carriage exploded in a spray of springs and levers. The Sarah entity let out a sound like a dying modem, a high-pitched electronic shriek, and her grip finally snapped. She collapsed forward, her head hitting the table with a hollow wooden thud. She wasn't human. She was a mannequin, a sophisticated lure made of wax and wire, dressed in my sister's memory. The house reacted to the destruction of the typewriter with a violent shudder. A pipe burst in the wall behind me, spraying not water but that thick black ink-like fluid. It doused me, stinging my eyes and filling my mouth with the taste of copper and old dust. I stumbled out of the kitchen and into the main hallway. The walls were no longer covered in wallpaper. They were lined with thousands of micro-cassette tapes, all labeled with dates and names. I could hear them spinning, a low-frequency hum that vibrated in my skull, playing back the final screams of every subject the Vance family had ever processed. "Arthur!" I yelled into the dark. "I'm burning this place down! Do you hear me?" "You can't burn a library, Elias. You can only be checked out." I looked up. Arthur was standing there, holding a kerosene lamp. In his other hand, he held a heavy, leather-bound book. He looked down at me with a strange, paternal pity. "The men in the suits are the editors," Arthur explained, gesturing to the front door where the yellow-clad figures were now visible through the glass, their silhouettes framed by the storm. "They ensure the facts match the record. You have become a very difficult footnote. We've had to rewrite your Chapter 3 times tonight." Behind me, the ink was rising again, flowing out of the kitchen and down the hallway like a slow-moving lava flow. It was consuming the floorboards, turning the solid house into a swamp of forgotten data. I looked toward the front door. The editors were there. I looked toward the back. The ink and the Sarah puppet were there. Then I saw it. To my right, a small door I hadn't noticed before. It was labeled Private Collection. I didn't think. I kicked the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut and throwing the bolt just as the first yellow-gloved hand shattered the glass of the front door. I was in a small circular room. There were no windows. The walls were covered in mirrors, but they weren't silvered glass. They were polished sheets of dark obsidian. When I looked into them, I didn't see my reflection. I saw my memories.
In one mirror, I saw myself as a child playing in the backyard with Sarah. In another, I saw the day I got my acceptance letter to grad school. In a third, I saw the moment I first saw the job listing for the Vance estate. But as I watched, the images began to change. The childhood memory warped. The backyard became the woods outside, and the subject vultures were perched on the swing set. The acceptance letter dissolved into a death warrant. The job listing was replaced by a photo of me, lying in the dark, my eyes replaced by the amber eyes of the shed. "They're taking them," I whispered, my voice trembling. "They're editing my life." The mirrors weren't just showing me memories, they were extracting them. I felt a sudden sharp void in my mind. The name of my first-grade teacher vanished. Then the memory of my mother's face started to blur. They were stripping me of my identity to make room for the subject profile. From the other side of the door, I heard the pneumatic hiss of the bolt guns. The editors were here. "Elias," a voice whispered from the center of the room. I turned. There was no one there, but a single old-fashioned telephone sat on a pedestal in the middle of the obsidian circle. It was ringing. I picked it up, my heart in my throat. "Hello? Elias, it's me," the voice said. It was Sarah, the real Sarah. Her voice was faint, as if she were calling from 1,000 miles away. "I'm in the crawl space beneath the mirrors. There's a loose stone behind the graduation reflection. You have to break it. You have to break the record." The door to the room groaned under a heavy blow. A yellow axe blade bit through the wood. "How?" I sobbed. "I don't have anything." "Use your weight," she whispered. "Use the truth. They can't archive a story that hasn't been finished." The axe swung again, this time wider. I looked at the obsidian mirror showing my graduation. I saw the pride in my own eyes, a version of myself that felt like a stranger. I realized then that the only way to save my past was to destroy the vessel that held it. I took a deep breath, ignored the axe wielder breaking through the door, and hurled myself head first into the dark glass.
I expected the impact to shatter my skull. I expected the sharp, cold bite of obsidian shards and the finality of a blackout. Instead, hitting the mirror felt like diving into a pool of freezing liquid mercury. The glass didn't break. It yielded. I passed through a membrane of cold, oily resistance and tumbled through a void of static and white noise before slamming onto a hard, uneven surface. I gasped, my lungs burning as I inhaled air that tasted like ancient ozone and wet charcoal. I was no longer in the circular room. I was underneath it. The space was a low-profile crawl space, maybe 3 feet high, stretching out into a forest of vertical wooden pillars that supported the house above. But these weren't just support beams. Each pillar was wrapped in miles of magnetic tape, the guts of thousands of cassette reels, winding up and down like the copper coils of a massive, archaic battery. The sound was deafening. It was a physical weight, a low, thrumming vibration of 1,000 voices talking at once, a cacophony of recorded lives hummed through the wood. "Elias." The voice was mere feet away. I turned my head, my cheek scraping against the cold, packed dirt. A few feet to my left, a figure was curled between 2 tape-wrapped pillars. It was Sarah, the real Sarah. She wasn't the waxy puppet from the kitchen, nor the root-choked horror from the tunnel. She was thin, her clothes tattered and stained with that black ink, but her eyes, though tired and rimmed with red, were human. She was holding a pair of rusted industrial shears, the kind used for cutting wire. "You came back," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the pillars. "I told them you wouldn't. I told them you were too smart." "Sarah, oh God," I choked out, crawling toward her. The floor here was littered with discarded drafts, shredded photos, warped tapes, and pages of half-written biographies that the house had rejected. I reached her and pulled her into a desperate hug. She felt frail, like a bird made of glass. "We have to go, now. The men in the suits, they're right above us." As if on cue, a heavy thud shook the floorboards directly over our heads. Dust and splinters rained down on us.
Through the gaps in the wood, I could see the flickering yellow light of the editor's flashlights. They were pacing the room I had just escaped, searching for the subject who had vanished into the glass. "We can't just run," Sarah said, her grip tightening on my arm. She pointed to the pillars. "This is the brain, Elias. All the memories, all the subjects. This is where the house stores the power. If we leave, they'll just find someone else. They'll find you again. They have your scent now. You're already in the files." She handed me the heavy shears. Her hands were shaking. "The tape. You have to cut the tape. It's the only way to break the loop." I looked at the pillars. The magnetic tape was pulsing, a dull, rhythmic glow passing through the ribbons of plastic. I realized that the house wasn't just a museum of the dead, it was a processor. It took the energy of a life, the narrative, and converted it into whatever kept Arthur Vance young and this estate standing. I crawled to the nearest pillar. The voices coming from it grew louder as I approached. I could hear a man describing his wedding day. I could hear a child crying for their mother. I could hear a woman laughing at a joke I'd never know. It was a symphony of stolen moments. "Do it," Sarah urged. I positioned the shears around the thickest bundle of tape. The metal was cold and heavy. As I squeezed the handles, the vibration in the air reached a pitch fever. The voices turned into a collective scream. Snip. The ribbon of tape severed with a sound like a violin string snapping. Immediately, the house above us let out a groan of pure agony. The floorboards buckled, and a section of the ceiling collapsed, sending a heavy obsidian mirror crashing down just inches from my legs. The red light from the hallway above bled into the crawl space, illuminating the editors as they peered down into the hole. "Retrieval status compromised. The archive is hemorrhaging. Initiate scorched earth protocol." "They're going to burn it," I realized, the smell of chemical accelerant suddenly wafting through the cracks. "Let it burn," Sarah cried, her face illuminated by a sudden orange glow from the far end of the crawl space. "But we have to get to the wellhead. It's the only way out that isn't connected to the house's foundation." I grabbed Sarah's hand, the shears still clutched in my other. We began to crawl through the forest of pillars, our movements frantic as the hum of the tapes turned into a high-pitched whine. Behind us, I heard the whoosh of an incendiary device. The black ink on the ground caught fire instantly, turning into a liquid flame that licked at the tape-wrapped pillars. As the tapes melted, the voices were released. A gale-force wind of sound whipped through the crawl space, 1,000 ghosts of sound screaming their final release. We reached the base of the wellhead, the same shaft I had climbed earlier, but this time it was different. The stone wasn't cold, it was vibrating. I looked up. The opening at the top was a small circle of gray light, but standing in front of it was a silhouette. Arthur Vance. He wasn't holding a rock this time. He was holding a flare, the red phosphorus dripping like blood onto the stones. "A story is only as good as its ending, Elias, and a tragedy is the most enduring genre of all." He dropped the flare. The flare tumbled through the air like a falling star, trailing a thick, choking wake of red smoke. It bounced off the mossy stones of the well, hissing as it hit the wet floor just feet from where Sarah and I huddled. The light was blinding, painting the entire circular shaft in a violent, pulsating crimson. Above us, Arthur's silhouette vanished from the rim, replaced by the crackling roar of the house as the scorched earth protocol took hold. The heat was instantaneous. The house above wasn't just wood anymore. It was a pressurized furnace of melting plastic and ancient oil-soaked paper. The black ink that had flooded the basement was now a river of fire. And I could hear the editors moving with terrifying, robotic precision above, sealing the exits to ensure nothing, not even a scrap of the archive, survived the purge. "The ladder, Elias! Move!" Sarah screamed, her voice barely audible over the roar of the fire. I grabbed the first rebar rung. It was already hot to the touch. I hauled myself up, my muscles screaming in protest, and reached back down to grab Sarah's hand. Her grip was weak, her skin slick with sweat and grime. I pulled her up onto the ladder behind me. We climbed like animals, driven by a primal terror that bypassed the exhaustion in our limbs. Halfway up the shaft, the world tilted. A massive explosion rocked the foundation of the house. I felt the stones of the well shift, grinding against one another. A heavy hunk of masonry dislodged from the rim and plummeted past us, clipping my shoulder and sending a jolt of white-hot agony through my arm. I nearly lost my grip, my boots scrabbling against the wet stone for purchase. "Keep going," Sarah urged from below, her head pressed against my lower back. "Don't look down." I looked up instead. The circle of the wellhead was no longer gray. It was framed by an orange and black corona of fire. The shed, the house, the trees, everything was being consumed. As I reached the final 3 rungs, a figure stepped into the light. It was one of the editors. The yellow chemical suit was blackened and melting, the gas mask's filters clogged with soot. He didn't have his bolt gun anymore. Instead, he was holding a heavy iron grate, the original cover for the well. He began to slide it over the opening, his movements jerky and mechanical, like a damaged clockwork toy. "Subject 104 and 42 must be archived," the voice modulator sputtered, the words breaking apart into digital static. "No!" I roared. I reached the top and thrust my hands through the gap before he could seal it. The heavy iron edge slammed down onto my fingers, the pain so intense I felt my vision go gray at the edges. But I didn't pull back. I used the pain. I used the image of my car in those photos, the memory of the Sarah puppet, and the thousands of screaming voices in the tapes. I shoved upward with my legs, my shoulders wedged against the underside of the grate. With a guttural, inhuman scream, I heaved. The editor, caught off balance by the sheer desperation of my strength, stumbled back. The grate clattered onto the grass. I scrambled out of the hole, my fingers mangled and bleeding, and reached back down for Sarah. I caught her wrists and hauled her out just as a plume of fire erupted from the shaft behind her, a vertical jet of flame fueled by the gas and the melting archives below. We lay on the wet grass for a second, gasping for air that wasn't filled with smoke. But we weren't safe. The estate was a funeral pyre. The Vance house was collapsing into its own basement, the floors pancaking one by one. And through the smoke, I saw them. These subjects. They weren't in the trees anymore. They were standing in a wide circle around the burning house, their waxy, gray faces illuminated by the flames. They weren't watching the fire. They were watching us. And then out of the front door of the collapsing mansion walked Arthur Vance. He wasn't running. He wasn't burned. He walked down the porch steps as the roof caved in behind him, his suit perfectly pressed, his leather-bound book still tucked under his arm. He stopped at the edge of the driveway and looked at me. His eyes weren't the eyes of a man. They were the same amber, unblinking eyes I had seen in the wood grain of the shed. "You've ruined the collection, Elias," he said softly. The sound of his voice carried perfectly over the roar of the inferno. He opened the book and tore out a single page. He let the wind catch it. The paper danced through the air, glowing orange as it drifted toward me. I reached out and caught it. It was a photo. A fresh, high-resolution photo of me and Sarah huddled together by the well, our faces twisted in terror. "The archive isn't the paper," Arthur whispered, his form beginning to blur and stretch, his limbs lengthening until he looked like the very hemlocks surrounding us. Then he turned and walked into the wall of fire. He didn't burn. He simply dissolved into the smoke. "Elias, the car!" Sarah wheezed, pointing toward the gravel drive. My beat-up sedan was still there, sitting like a ghost in the fog. I grabbed her and we ran. I didn't have my keys, they were in the basement, but I didn't care. I smashed the driver's side window with a rock, hot-wired the ignition with the frantic speed of a man possessed, and slammed the car into reverse. As we roared down that gravel driveway, I looked in the rearview mirror. The house was gone, replaced by a pillar of black smoke that reached toward the moon. But as the fog swallowed the estate, I saw a single yellow-suited figure standing in the middle of the road, holding a camera. The flash went off one last time.
We didn't stop driving until the sun breached the horizon, painting the jagged peaks of the Cascades in a cruel, mocking gold. I drove until the gas light had been on for 40 miles, finally pulling into a dilapidated 24-hour diner on the outskirts of a town I didn't recognize. Sarah hadn't said a word the entire trip. She just stared out the window, her fingers tracing the jagged scars on her collarbone where the roots had been. When the local police arrived, I tried to tell them everything. I told them about Arthur Vance, the basement, the men in the yellow suits, and the archive of stolen lives. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. They saw two traumatized people in a stolen, window-smashed car, covered in ink and soot. But when the deputies went out to the estate, they found nothing. They found the charred remains of a foundation, yes. They found a hole in the ground where a well had been, but there were no archives. There were no bodies in the trees. The root cellar was just a collapsed, mud-filled cavity. The fire had been too hot, too thorough. It had sanitized the horror, leaving behind only the ash of unidentifiable organic matter. Arthur Vance? There was no record of a man by that name owning the property since 1924. The estate had been in legal limbo for decades, tied up in a web of shell companies and offshore trusts that led nowhere. The police eventually chalked it up to a squatter dispute or a drug-induced psychotic break. Because Sarah had been missing for 3 years, her reappearance was a miracle to the public, but to the authorities, it was a liability. She couldn't tell them where she'd been, not in a way that made sense to a court of law. She spoke of the narrative and the wood eyes. After a month in a psychiatric ward, she stopped talking about it altogether. Now, we live in a small apartment in a city 3 states away. We have 3 deadbolts on the door and a security system that costs more than our rent. Sarah doesn't like to go outside when it's foggy. I don't like to look at printed photos. But the horror of the Vance estate didn't end when the fire went out. 3 months ago, I received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a thick, leather-bound book. The cover was blank. I opened it, my hands shaking, expecting to see the files, the names, the subjects. Instead, it was a printed transcript of my own life since the escape. October 12th, Elias buys a coffee. He looks over his shoulder 4 times. He is still flavorful. November 3rd, Elias wakes up screaming. The memory is ripening. Every mundane detail, every secret fear I've had since that night was meticulously documented in that dry, papery font. And at the bottom of the last page, there was a single handwritten note in that familiar, elegant script. The best stories are the ones that never truly end, Elias. You think you escaped the archive, but you only expanded the collection. Every time you tell this story, every time you think of my name, you are scanning the pages for me. I burned the book in the kitchen sink. I watched the words turn to black ash, hoping that would be the end of it. But as the smoke rose, I smelled it again, the copper, the mothballs, the industrial bleach. I went to the bathroom to splash cold water on my face. I looked in the mirror, bracing myself to see the exhaustion and the fear. But as I leaned in, I noticed a small, dark blemish on my temple, right where the rock had grazed me. I touched it. It wasn't a scab. It wasn't a mole. I leaned closer to the glass. It was a tiny, perfectly formed letter E etched into my skin in the exact typeface of an old Smith Corona typewriter. And right next to it, another letter was beginning to form. I looked into my own pupils, and for a split second they didn't look like eyes. They looked like camera lenses reflecting a man in a yellow suit standing directly behind me in the shower stall. I didn't turn around. I knew if I did, the chapter would finally be closed. So if you're listening to this, if you're reading these words, be careful which jobs you take. Be careful which stories you believe, because some libraries don't just want your late fees. They want your skin, they want your memories, and they're always looking for a new subject to help finish the draft. Good night, and stay out of the basement.